Hello, this is Jim Rovira, and this is my second lecture on meter for my creative writing poetry class. Now, as I said in the previous lecture, just for the purposes of this class, we're going to emphasize that a stressed syllable is a syllable that's pronounced a little bit more loudly than the ones next to it. Now, stress can be absolute and it can be relative. And, and while in normal speech, um, a word may have one clearly stressed syllable and one clearly unstressed syllable. In the conditions of a poem, those unstressed syllables can actually be elevated to carry a stress. And sometimes, but less often, a stress syllable can be demoted so that it's not carrying a stress. So you need to be sensitive to both how the word works in normal speech, which you can see just by going to dictionary.com, listening to the little playback of the sound and paying attention to the indication of what syllable is stressed by looking at the word. And you need to pay attention to how the poem's meter or pattern of stress and unstressed syllables is wanting readers to impose or not impose a stress on any given part of a word at any given time. So, but there's still some general rules, and for the most part, stress and unstressed syllables are going to follow everyday speech patterns. So, in the word running, the first syllable run is stressed, and the second syllable ng is not. The ing ending of any word is almost never stressed. It's almost always unstressed. Um, In some circumstances, it might get promoted to having an equal stress with the syllable next to it. Um, there may be some circumstances in which you say running. I don't know. I don't know of any, but that may occur in a poem. Very seldom will you stress the ing ending above the syllable to its left, though. Um, Prepositions of at, so on, they're pretty well never stressed. Functions and but are very rarely stressed. Articles a and the are very rarely stressed. Again, in any given poem, any of these can be promoted to carry a stress, but in normal circumstances they're not. So if you start a line of poetry with an article such as a, an, or the, you're probably you're starting with an unstressed syllable. The only way these normally unstressed uh, single syllable words come to take a stress is when you strongly establish a pattern in a poem, and then continue that pattern into a line where you would usually have a stressed a stressed syllable where a normally unstressed word is. Now, what usually happens in those circumstances is you'll have three syllables in a row that are normally unstressed, and the middle one will tend to take a stress because, say, you're writing an iambic verse, which is unstressed, stress, unstressed, stress. So if you were to say, I'm running to the store, I'm would be unstressed, run would be stressed, ing would be unstressed. And because you have this pattern of unstressed, stressed, unstressed, two, which normally does not take a stress, usually would in this case. And then the is normally unstressed. And then store, single syllable word, would be stressed. So follow those basic rules, pay attention to the pattern established by the poem, and that will guide you through scanning poetry. The Fry text is great at teaching scanning poetry, as I think I mentioned in an introductory lecture. So just let Fry teach you to listen, okay? But I want to emphasize, while I'm emphasizing that stress is the syllables pronounced a little bit more loudly than the one next to it, stress can also be registered by juxtaposition of syllables that have long and short pronunciation time, like fit and long. So the I in fit does not take as long to pronounce as the O in long, or by musical pitch, which syllable is pronounced at a slightly higher pitch than the other, and which syllable is pronounced at a lower pitch than the other. So the I in fit has a higher pitch than the O in long. Now, all of these are working at once in a poem. Most of the time, all we register is which one's a little bit more loud, pronounced a little bit more loudly than the others. But all of them work at once. So if you can be sensitive to that in your poetry, pay attention to sound on the level of the individual syllable, and use it to your advantage, you're going to be a fantastic poet. Now, I'm not saying all poetry has to employ meter and all poetry has to employ sound effects, because obviously that's not true, especially since about the middle of the 19th century. However, if you're aware of how meter works and if you're aware of how sound effects work, when you're writing even free verse, you're going to use those to your advantage. You may follow fixed patterns and you may not. You may not follow a fixed pattern and then hit on a pattern to emphasize a line or an idea. There's a variety of things that you can do. But the important thing right now is just to learn to listen, to open up your ears and hear these features in a language you may never have noticed before. You can hear them in everyday speech. And once you learn to do that, you can hear the poetry of everyday speech. That's one of the reasons why the early exercises in the Fry text are so silly and mundane. He doesn't want you to write about these grand topics. He wants you to write about the weather. He wants you to write about how fat and overweight our bodies are. He wants you to write about how the sounds you hear outside. He doesn't want you to worry about content yet. He just wants you to focus on the sound of the lines. So take these few principles and use them to guide your listening to your own poetry, listening as you read silently, and listening as you actually listen to how people speak around you. Learn to identify these patterns, okay? And yes, it is an important part of your grade in this class. I mean, I'm going to ask you to write, say, iambic pentameter. That means you need to know where the stress falls on a word. If you're really not sure, just start with a dictionary that's going to show you. But it's better if you learn to listen, okay? When you're reading each other's poems, praise the good stuff, of course, do that always. And if you see errors in meter, point them out and maybe suggest a revision. Now, the thing about meter is a poem that follows it perfectly and flawlessly and without variation is really boring to read. So deviations from, say, a strict iambic pentameter are not necessarily wrong. They just need to be strategically placed. So you establish the poem's meter in the first line or the first couple of lines, and then you vary it when you want that variation to mean something. That's how you write effective poetry, by combining the sound of the lines, the mood and tone implied by your choice of words, and the meaning of the lines. Consider all of those. But for right now, early exercises, it's just stressed and unstressed syllables. And learn to listen for those. And then add to your understanding and to your listening once you've mastered how to just identify which syllables are pronounced a little bit more loudly than others at first. And that's it for this second lecture on meter. There's a scanning poetry PowerPoint. I didn't put that together. That was put together by a professor from Tiffin University named Janet Hanna, who passed away in 2008, I think. I had to take over her Elizabethan Poetry and Culture course at the beginning of the spring 2008 semester because she unexpectedly passed away. So I kind of inherited her course materials, and I'd like to keep her alive a little bit by passing it on to you. So her PowerPoint combines visuals with some of her speech, and it'll be very helpful for you. Thank you.